So here's where imperial legacy comes in. The first thing you have to understand, and you probably already know this, is that much of the world was carved up by the Europeans, which meant that you had these random population splits. Think, for example, about Africa. The borders were artificially drawn up over a negotiating table in Europe. We had the Berlin Conference in 1884. So they divvied Africa up, especially between Great Britain, France, Portugal, and Belgium. What this means is that you lack natural borders, things like rivers and mountains in many cases. And what borders exist, and of course there are borders, just they're not natural borders, the borders that have been drawn don't reflect ethnic group divisions. So you can have ethnic groups that are split between two, maybe three, maybe even four new entities, which subsequently in the post-colonial experience become countries. So this makes trying to unify the state through a social means much more difficult. You also had, in these various places, imported bureaucratic structures. These were often dropped down, literally replicas of schools, police, judiciary institutions, regional governors, etc., that in the home state functioned, and they expected these to take root in these overseas colonies as well. Now, there were some good sides to this. For example, the infrastructure. Roads were put down. Education. Educational networks were established. In terms of health, you had an increase in life expectancy as you had more and more doctors, Western educated doctors coming in. But you also have some not so good sides. The roads, for example, were limited. You could only go where the Europeans wanted you to go. In other words, they wouldn't build roads everywhere. They would build a road from the port city to the main mining town, not to all the other towns and cities surrounding. Okay? They had their economic interests in mind. The educational system was severely slanted, so that, for example, it was very disparaging towards the locals. What was right, what was correct, was the Western way. So there are lots of downsides as well. Now, some, especially Great Britain, relied more on local structures, the bureaucratic structures. Others, especially France, imported these structures. And that meant that you had different levels of experience in the colonial administration when decolonization began. So in the British case, you had much more, a higher number of locals who were actually involved in running the state, which becomes important. In the French cases, fewer. In terms of cultural change, you have new notions of ethnic identity that are imported from Europe as well. These are pushed on people who are much more familiar with familial, clan, religious, and economic identifications. Now it's about ethnic group. They said these Europeans tended to say that one or more ethnic groups are better than the others, giving privileges to them in the new system. And you also have new religions coming in, Christianity, Islam being spread as well, obviously not by the Europeans. These are things that are introduced that are often partially forced on the populations. They're indoctrinated in schools. If you want an education for your child's going to get this too. It's a 2-for-1 deal. So looking at how this plays out, look at places like, well, the quintessential case is Rwanda, where Hutus and Tutsis lived together as neighbors before the colonial period. And then under Belgian rule, scientists actually came to do things like measure skulls, brain size, and they decided that Tutsis had Caucasian ancestry and were, quote-unquote, superior to the Hutus. They gave political power to the Tutsis. They were lighter skinned, they were taller, they had these larger heads. They issued racial identification cards. You were either a Hutu or a Tutsi. Tutsis got the administration. They had access to education. And there was frustration among other Rwandans, the Hutu majority. Tutsis were also indoctrinated into this paradigm of racial superiority and became defensive over power. They exploited the Hutu majority. In 1994, you had Hutu attacks on the Tutsis that were part of an orchestrated genocide. In a very short period, you had about 800,000 primarily Tutsis killed in one of the most brutal genocides in the recent past. So beyond cultural change, we can also talk about migration, forced migration. So again, what we're talking about is bringing new cultures into the mix. It wasn't just the random population splits, but also forced migration. To give you an example, in South Africa, on the East Coast, the Brits found that there was lots of sugarcane they could harvest. They needed the manpower. The Zulus refused to harvest this for them. And so what did they do? Well, they brought in about 1 million Indians into KwaZulu-Natal. so this large immigrant population, which is now very it's a very salient aspect of the identity in that particular region. So all of these factors help contribute to a rise in nationalism. In the 1950s and 1960s, look at Europe. Europe is weak. This is after World War II. This is a period. Remember, we talked about the Marshall Plan. They're taking aid in from the United States. They're increasingly self-absorbed. All around the colonial world, you saw the growth of reformers, modernizers movements, nationalism. All these things were European-based. Nationalism was taught by the Europeans, and nationalism becomes strong. Again, Europeans brought this ethnic identity. They brought this idea of nationalism, which flourished in the 19th century in Europe. Most in Europe and Asia, most in Africa and Asia gained their independence during this period, the 1950s and 1960s. So this is the major period of decolonization, and it's largely a nationalist period. And this brings us to the point of independence. Now, Latin America had gained independence back in the 19th century, primarily following Napoleon's invasion of Spain and Portugal. But Asia and Africa become independent to a large degree in the 1950s and 1960s. Large swaths of Asia were already independent beforehand, but the colonies become freed at this point during European weakness. So post-imperial economics, this goes back to the legacies we were talking about. The economic system under the colonial empire was one that was good for the imperial master, not the proto-state subject. Trade was targeted with the master. For example, you had a franc zone in Western Africa. You had Commonwealth Games in the British case after you had decolonization. So trade remains targeted, remains skewed. These trade dependencies remain. The economy remains skewed, based largely on raw materials, especially things like agriculture, cotton, wood, coffee. This is problematic because these are things that have very little value. These are the sorts of goods that are sent north back to Europe or America or somewhere else wealthy, and then they're finished, and then they're often returned, and they become very expensive. It also means you don't have technology coming into these states. You don't have a know-how transfer that's brought into these states. We'll talk about that more when we talk about globalization. But to give you an idea of how this plays out, in the case of Central Asia, which had been a Russian colony and then existed under the Soviet Union, you have these production and trade dependencies. Factories were created. Each one of them had a component part in a different place. So, for example, in Uzbekistan, you might make the engine to an airplane. In Kazakhstan, you might make the wings. In Russia, you might make the cockpit equipment. All these things, once you have the decline, you have these post-colonial legacies that exist. The direction of trade was historically to Russia, from Central Asia to Russia. This is in particular with respect to cotton, which is a huge crop, especially in Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, but also with respect to oil and gas lines coming out of Kazakhstan, for example, Turkmenistan. So you have all the direction of trade is going one direction. Well, after this colonization period ends, you've got these newly independent states, but most of their trade is still targeted in that same direction. Going on to the monopolistic industries. The existing businesses under the colonial period were monopolistic, so there was a lack of competition, and local entrepreneurialism was severely limited. Small farmers in the most lucrative and fertile areas had been driven out for the big dominating farms that were in the interest of the colonial powers. And again, this is one of those legacies that stays around for a while. The dominance of these huge industries. Industry being used as in a very flexible way. So we can be talking about plantations, for example. And finally, you've got very limited infrastructure. Basically, infrastructure is limited to, as I mentioned before, to where it's necessary. So vast areas of the population were not involved in the market. They were literally undefendable because they were in the outskirts. There were no roads, no railroads that you could you could go off and control them with. So they were only nominally under control. It's hard to tax them. It's hard to defend your borders when you don't have these networks that go across the country, as in post-colonial states was typical. So other aspects of statehood were also hurt by the colonial legacy, and these, again, the lack of geographically defined borders means a weakened ability to defend oneself. These states were poorly developed, so they lack a means to provide other public goods, things like roads and sewers and schools. This includes security domestically. They are unwilling or unable to enforce laws. Again, if they're poorly developed, that means that they've got a weak tax base, and so how are you going to do these things? You lack a competent bureaucracy, especially where foreigners ran the bureaucracies, and then they left with independence. Instead, as the state develops its taxing capabilities, the state bureaucracy becomes a central sphere of corruption. It becomes a source of clientelism, of patrimonialism, of rent seeking. So if you support us, we'll give you a job somewhere in the bureaucracy. It's often the only stable work that there is. You've got limited autonomy on the domestic level. Primarily, you have to rely on coercion and some co-optation, for example, in clientelism and patrimonialism. But the autonomy is limited in part because you can't provide for public goods. People don't need to listen to you because you're not giving anything to them. Again, go back to the role of the state. Our purpose in listening to the state, in obeying the state, is to get something out of it. Right? The state gives us security, and we can understand that broadly through things like health as well. And in return, we give up some of our freedoms. So finally, you've got limited sovereignty in addition on the international level. These states tend to be weak. They're easily pushed around in international forums, especially where they need money. Places like the World Bank, the IMF, multinational corporations can kick them around. And so it's not easy to be a post-colonial state. I'm going to go back into the next slide.